Good day. Today is Thursday, 12th June 2025, and just before I started making this program, I saw the news about the air crash in India. I would like to wish respects and good wishes and blessings on all of those people who are connected to the people on that plane. I hope there are survivors. I devoutly hope that there are survivors. I'm not yet fully aware of the scale of the tragedy, but as I said, my thoughts and prayers are with all of those involved, those on the plane and their loved ones who must be now anxiously waiting for news. I think the best thing to do, having said that, is to move on, however, with the rest of my program. And the other thing that I saw as I started this program, and in fact it's been building up now for several weeks, is that the drumbeat for an Israeli attack against Iran is becoming louder and louder. There are reports this morning that Israel is perhaps days, perhaps hours away from conducting an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. Supposedly, the Israelis have despaired of the United States finding a diplomatic solution to the question of Iran's nuclear weapons development. That is, by the way, a ridiculous claim. We're still at an early stage in the negotiations. I've said many times that there is no obvious or logical or coherent reason why those negotiations should not reach a positive outcome, given that both Iran and its adversaries all appear to agree on the same ultimate destination point, which is an Iran which does not have nuclear weapons. So all of the conditions appear to me to exist for a satisfactory agreement. And yesterday, the Russian government officially confirmed that it is fully prepared to act as honest broker and to act as keeper of any unwanted enriched uranium which Iran wishes to transfer to Russia as part of a deal entered into with the United States. So it seems to me that there is absolutely no conceivable purpose or logic or reason for an attack on Iran at this time. I suspect that this has much more to do with Israel's own regional ambitions, the fraught situation in terms of its own domestic politics, its disappointment that the conflict in Gaza continues without any obvious resolution in sight. And I suspect, as I said, it has absolutely nothing ultimately to do with any genuine fears that Iran is indeed in the position anytime soon to detonate a nuclear device or to acquire a nuclear device, or genuine fears that a deal preventing Iran from developing a nuclear device cannot be achieved. In my opinion, and just to say this again, I suspect that this is all about achieving regime change in Iran. If one looks at those who advocate this attack on Iran, all of them clearly want to see regime change in that country. It remains with some of them, I should say, something of an obsession. And there is also this belief, which is very widespread, in fact, it's almost a commonplace amongst people in the West, that the Iranian government, that the Iranian political system within Iran itself is deeply unpopular, that if it is attacked, the entire political system in Iran will simply disintegrate, and that the government will collapse and regime change will be achieved with effortless ease. I am not familiar with the state of internal politics in Iran. I suspect that the Iranian government is indeed often unpopular over many things. I suspect that there are many people in Iran which would like to see the present political system in Iran changed. But I think that the extent of fissures within Iranian society are overstated. My own sense is that Iran is a very, very nationalistic place, that in the event that there is an attack on the country, the various political groups in Iran will consolidate, the population will consolidate, and will dig in for a long struggle. I may be completely wrong in all of those assumptions. I am troubled by the fact that no one ever discusses them or considers what the actual alternative realities of the situation in Iran might truly be. But anyway, we seem to be closer now than we have perhaps ever been before to an Israeli attack on Iran. We're getting reports, I've seen reports that President Trump himself is saying that he's less confident about a potential deal within Iran than he was, which I think some people will interpret as a green light for an attack on Iran. I also am reading reports that the US is starting to evacuate embassy staff from across the Middle East in anticipation of possible Iranian retaliation. As I said, all of the signals, all of them suggest that an attack on Iran is coming. And I should say that I strongly doubt that the Iranian government will believe that if the Israelis do attack Iran, that they are doing so without assistance from the United States. And I have to also say that I also personally doubt that Israel is able to conduct such an attack on Iran without at least some level of assistance from the United States. Well, this is a developing story. No doubt over the next couple of days, we will see further developments. I will obviously return to it as things develop. We shall see where all this goes. I've read many reports about how deeply hardened the Iranian nuclear facilities are, how they are buried far deep beneath mountains, putting them basically out of reach for the Israeli Air Force. That might be true, or it might not be true. But then, to repeat a point I've made elsewhere, since the objective, or so it seems to me, is not so much to disrupt or destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, but rather to achieve regime change in Iran, I wonder whether the real target will in fact be the nuclear facilities, whether Israel might not instead choose to conduct a decapitation strike, for example, against the Iranian leadership, or something more of that sort. Anyway, as I said, this is a developing story. I will return to it in future programs. Now, over the last couple of days, the last 2 weeks or so, I've been discussing the situation in Ukraine. I should say that there's been a lot more news about the military developments in Ukraine over the last 24 hours. I've seen that the Ukrainians themselves are now speaking with growing alarm about the situation in Yunakovka, this fortified village in Sumy region. I have also heard they are saying that the situation there for the Ukrainians is becoming very difficult, which is usually a sign that Yunakovka is about to fall. The last clear reports I got was that the main supply roads to Yunakovka had been cut by the Russian military. I suspect that probably over the next couple of hours, the Ukrainians will withdraw their forces from Yunakivka. And there are all other reports of further Russian advances in the Sumy area, and that the Russians are getting ever closer to the city of Sumy itself, which apparently has now been largely evacuated of its citizens. Just to say, so deteriorating military situation in Sumy region. There are also reports that the Russians are getting ever closer to trapping Ukrainian troops who are still trying to hold positions south of Konstantinovka, the town that is the major part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, the southern part of that conurbation. I'm not sure why the Ukrainians have not retreated to Konstantinovka itself, where I would have thought there would be more defendable positions, but never mind. And there are also reports that the Russians have either captured or are about to capture a village called Mirny, which is located to the east of Pokrovsk. If you look at a map, Mirny appears to be the last village in front of the much bigger village of Novoekonomichny. It looks as if the Russians now are very close to being in a position to advance on Novoekonomichny itself. By universal consensus, if the Russians were to capture Novoekonomichny, which is, as I said, located immediately to the east of Pokrovsk and Pokrovsk's eastern suburb, Mirnograd, then the major supply lines to Pokrovsk from every direction, east, west and north, would effectively be cut off as well, leaving the Ukrainian forces who are trying to defend and hold on to Pokrovsk in, well, maybe not exactly a cauldron, but in an unsustainable position. So you can see that the situation continues to deteriorate. And in the meantime, the Russian authorities, the Russian Ministry of Defense, continues to talk about the advance of the Russian army in Dnipro region. They say that the 90th Tank Division is now operating on the territory of Dnipro region. They say that it has now been joined by an infantry brigade. So it looks as if the Russian army is continuing its advance into Dnipro region. There are lots of reports of various locations in Dnipro region, east of the Dnieper River, coming under attack by the Russians. Of the Russians now in control of perhaps 40% of the important strategic village of Komar in this general area, and apparently also working to cut off the garrison in Komar from resupply. And perhaps most interestingly, there were reports last night in the Zaporozhye region that the Russians have captured at least part of the building or set of buildings that make up the complex, a complex which was formerly a women's prison in the village of Malaya Tokmachka, which lies to the north of Rabotin. Malaya Tokmachka was one of the launch points of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive as it sought to break through to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea. Anyway, there are reports that this fortified position is in the process of being captured by the Russian army. It is generally acknowledged that if this building or set of buildings is captured, the village of Malaya Tokmachka itself will become undefendable for the Ukrainians. And if Malaya Tokmachka falls under Russian control, then the key town of Orechov will also be effectively encircled by the Russians. They're also advancing towards Orekhov. From the west, Malaya Tokmachka, so far as I can see, is quite close to Orekhov. On the east, if Orekhov is captured by the Russians, then it seems to me that with the Russians also advancing on the east bank of the Dnieper, the way is open for the Russians to advance onto the city of Zaporozhye itself. So you can see that the situation, the military situation, is deteriorating. There's an awful lot more than can be said about it, which I'm not going to do in this program, but it's important always to remember that we are dealing with a military conflict in Ukraine. With every single day that passes, that conflict continues and the Russian advance continues. Many people still talk about the slow nature of this advance. In my opinion, on the contrary, the advance is accelerating all the time, and it is now taking place right across the conflict line. And I should say that I've had a very interesting email from a member of the Duran community who's a former Indian military officer, or rather, I don't think he was an officer, but he was. So anyway, he was in the Indian military. He seems to have a military background, and he has suggested that this follows the pattern of Russian operations, of the so-called deep war, or that the Russians developed, the theory of war that they developed in the period just before the Second World War, deep battle, that you use your frontline forces to break the resistance of the combat forces of the enemy. And then you have the reserve armies in the rear, the two reserve armies, prepared to take advantage and to launch big advances deep into the enemy's territory. In effect, bringing the battle to victory and perhaps the war to something closer to an end. Now, Zelensky himself, by the way, has been speaking about this, and he has said, and it's perhaps, I think, the first time that he's said this, though I might be wrong here. Anyway, he said that the Russians clearly have the objective to capture Odessa and the Black Sea coast of Ukraine, that the loss of the Black Sea coast will put the Russians in a position where they can threaten Southeast Europe, the Balkans in other words. For that reason, the Western powers should not allow this possibility, and he's talking about the need, therefore, for the West to continue to support Ukraine, even as, by the way, Ukraine continues to prepare for its dirty war, the dirty war that was announced by David Ignatius in the Washington Post in that article that I have discussed at such enormous length in recent programs, and even as Ukraine appears no longer interested in further negotiations with the Russians, with Zelensky all but saying that the Istanbul process, so far as he is concerned, is going nowhere, and that Ukraine is no longer interested in it. So he expects, apparently, the West to defend Odessa for him, even as he refuses to negotiate with the Russians, and even as he continues to lose the war. So that is perhaps entirely unsurprising. Now, that is Zelensky, and I get the sense that in the United States, the political leadership, Donald Trump and the people around him, are starting to lose interest in Ukraine. There's been some very strong comments by the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who spoke about the risks of World War III, about how some warmongers seem to be keen to push the world to World War III. I think that this is a veiled reference again to Ukraine's drone attacks on the Russian air bases, further reflecting the alarm and anger that some people in Washington seem to feel over this issue. But of course, Ukraine does continue to have its supporters, and we saw this again in Congress with people like Senator Mitch McConnell still talking about the need to go on supporting Ukraine. But overall, I get the sense that the political leadership in the United States, the president and his immediate circle of officials, appear to be, as I said, losing interest in this matter. They don't seem to be as interested in the conflict in Ukraine as perhaps they might have been. And there's been a very interesting exchange between the US and Russian governments. I say exchange. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has communicated a message to the Russian people for Russia Day, which is incidentally today. It is the day when the Russians commemorate Russia's declaration of sovereignty. This is whilst the Soviet Union still existed. It's, by the way, a holiday which Russians, in my experience, enjoy, but about which there is a certain degree of political ambivalence. But never mind. Anyway, Secretary Rubio made a rather warm statement to the Russians in connection with this celebration, and I will read it. You can find it on the State Department website. This is what Secretary Rubio said. On behalf of the American people, I want to congratulate the Russian people on Russia Day. The United States remains committed to supporting the Russian people as they continue to build on their aspirations for a brighter future. We also take the opportunity to reaffirm the United States' desire for constructive engagement with the Russian Federation to bring about a durable peace between Russia and Ukraine. It is our hope that peace will foster more mutually beneficial relations between our countries. Now, it is impossible to imagine Tony Blinken sending a message like that to Russia, and the Russians have noticed this message and the rather warm terms in which it is phrased. Obviously, some of this is what you might call boilerplate language, but notice, for example, that the United States remains committed to supporting the Russian people as they continue to build on their aspirations for a brighter future. Now, many Russians will probably be shaking their heads in, well, I won't say bafflement, but they'll be shaking their heads about the support that the United States has shown to the Russian people in the past as they build on their aspirations for a brighter future. Many Russians will feel, most Russians will feel, that the United States has not provided much support to Russia in that regard at all. They would say that obstruction is far more what Russia, as it aspires to a brighter future, has been receiving from the United States than support. And some Russians, perhaps most Russians, would say that it's not just obstruction, It's, well, frankly, outright attempts to throw Russia back. What, after all, were the sanctions that first Obama and then on a far greater scale Biden instituted against Russia, and the sanctions that Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal in the Senate have been talking about? What were those, if not sustained attempts by the United States to hurl Russia backwards? But let's put aside, just for 1 microsecond, these undoubted facts of very recent history and indeed of the present. And let's just consider, just unpack some of what Rubio is saying. He talks about the Russians continuing to build on their aspirations for a brighter future. Is that not perhaps an admission of what Russia is actually about? It's not set on conquering Europe or conquering the world or setting about establishing itself as some kind of authoritarian autocracy or anything of that kind. It is simply a country that wants to improve its own conditions to achieve a better future for itself and for its people. Anyway, just saying, maybe one shouldn't read too much into statements of this kind. But anyway, I find it impossible to reconcile a statement of this nature, a message of this nature sent by the United States to Russia with any immediate plan to impose massive sanctions on Russia. It's a further sign, it seems to me, that Lindsey Graham's sanctions are dead in the water, and it is a further sign that American support for Ukraine, for the moment at least, is diminishing. I know many people will say that this is an elaborate ruse to fool the Russians. I don't believe myself that that is the case. I think that is expecting too much in terms of conspiracy or planning or duplicity from the people who are from the people involved, people like Rubio and company. But anyway, it seems to me that the political leadership of the United States has basically written off Ukraine. This message is another sign of that. They've written off Ukraine. They realize that Ukraine is going to be defeated. They realize that the project that Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and the others and Victoria Nuland and the others had in Ukraine has failed. They want to find some way back to establishing some kind of long-term relationship with Russia. They understand that this is in the US's best interests to do, and that they're going to continue gradually to edge away from Ukraine, even as they continue gradually to seek some kind of normalization with Russia. Just saying. So I think that is what the political leadership is about. But the United States, the government of the United States, is a very complicated thing. And of course, there are others who take the different view. And as I said recently, David Ignatius' article in the New York Times, the one outlining the dirty war that Ukraine is preparing to wage against Russia, I have no doubt that that dirty war is actively supported by members of the US intelligence community. David Ignatius is very close indeed to the US intelligence community. And all the indications are that though the Trump administration, the politicians, in other words, have decided that they're going to walk away from Ukraine, or at least are going to edge gradually away from Ukraine. They're going to pursue normalization with Russia. The permanent bureaucracy, the intelligence community, those sorts of people, they have come to no such view. On the contrary, they're already looking to find some other way to conduct their permanent war of destabilization and regime change against Russia. And they're going to throw all the support that they can behind the dirty war against Russia that David Ignatius is talking about. Now, some people may find it surprising that the politicians might be pursuing one course and the permanent bureaucracy might be pursuing a different one. They might say that obviously this is a further sign of duplicity on the part of the politicians. All I would say about that is that it makes no sense, if you are being duplicitous in that way, to publicize the fact by publishing an article like the one that David Ignatius has published in the Washington Post, telling the Russians, look, whatever Donald Trump tells you, whatever Marco Rubio tells you about us wanting better relations with you, the reality is that Ukraine and ultimately we are going to do everything we possibly can to make life for you in the future as impossible as we possibly can. And by the way, and for the record, Vladimir Putin has on several occasions discussed a conversation he once had with George W. Bush. He said that he once met with Bush and pointed out to Bush that even as the two of them, that's to say Bush and Putin, broadly got on reasonably well with each other, the US intelligence community was busy assisting jihadi fighters in the Caucasus to carry out all kinds of terrorist-type attacks in Russia itself. And Putin asked Bush, what do you think of that? Why are you doing all of this? And Bush, it seems, was bewildered and said, well, this wasn't something he really knew anything very much about. So I, for one, do believe that it is entirely possible for sections of the permanent state, if you like, to do all kinds of things and to do them perhaps without the president being fully informed or properly briefed. It can be done in all sorts of different ways, often through third parties. And I would not be surprised if that's what we're seeing going to happen in Ukraine now. Anyway, the Russians are not impressed with any of this. And a lot of people were expecting that a Security Council meeting that the Russians had convened a day or so ago would result in all kinds of statements and decisions about what the Russians would do in response to the actions that the United States had been taking, or rather that the Ukrainians had been taking, in terms of the attacks on the airfields, the attacks on the railways, and those sort of things. Well, the Security Council meeting in Moscow did indeed take place, and it didn't really, at least the public parts of it, really didn't address the issue of Ukraine at all. The readout, rather the transcript of Putin's introductory words that the Kremlin has published, basically gives us a sense of what the discussion of the Security Council was about. Putin's introductory words read The agenda of today's meeting focuses on improving the state policy of protecting traditional Russian spiritual and moral values. And he goes on to say that this is an extremely important matter directly related to ensuring sovereignty and national interests of Russia, strengthening our security, social harmony and stability, addressing the vital issues of saving the number of population and demographic development, bringing up the younger generation and ensuring the continuity of our development as a state, nation and society. And there's no doubt that this is important and that the Russians do attach great importance to this topic, but it is not, of course, the topic that many expected the Russians to discuss, which was a topic of what the Russians would do in response to the attacks, the drone attacks on the air bases and the railways and all that kind of thing. Well, the first thing to say, of course, is that Security Council meetings in Russia can cover lots of topics, and it is not impossible. In fact, it is very likely that there was a classified section of the discussion which probably covered many of these issues. Also, I believe, and again I have reasons to believe this, that there has actually been another meeting of the Security Council, one which has been unannounced, in which all of these issues, Ukraine-related issues, were discussed. But be that as it may, shortly after, yesterday in fact, another meeting took place in the Kremlin, of which, again, we've only been provided with a brief outline by the Kremlin, and one which the military attended, and photographs have been released of it, and we can see all the top military people there in uniform. The Chief of the General Staff is there. All sorts of other important military people are there. And the top civilian leadership are also there. People like, Mishustin, the Prime Minister, Manturov, the Deputy Defense Minister, who was one of the lead speakers, and Deputy Prime Minister is one of the lead speakers, and of course the Russian Defense Minister, Andrei Belousov. So this meeting, we are told, was a meeting to discuss key parameters of the draft state armament program for 2027 to 2036. Now, this is consistent with things that we already know. We know that the Russian authorities, the senior officials of the Russian government, have been working hard on various plans, long-range plans for the future development of their armed forces. We know, for example, that Putin has just signed off on a plan for the modernization and development of the Russian Navy. We know about this because Nikolai Patrushev, he's Putin's former national security advisor, who is now in overall charge of Russia's shipbuilding and maritime industries, its merchant fleet, its naval fleet, its shipyards, all of that kind of thing, has told us as much. He's told us that there is such a plan and that it has already been provided to Putin, and he has signed off with it. So it's logical that at this point of time, especially given that we're talking about a country which does long-range planning, I mean, that is very much the Russian style of things. They work out a plan and then they work towards it. They allocate the funds, the resources, the industrial capital. They appoint the engineers. They instruct the scientists. They do this long-term planning, which is something that in the West today we struggle to do. But anyway, it makes sense that at this particular point in time, they would be looking at long-range plans for the future development of their armed forces. Now, if, however, you believe that all of these top military people and all of these top people from the security services, who I am sure were there also, would have been called together and there would not have been a discussion of recent events, of the attack on the air bases, for example, then I have a bridge to sell you. Now, obviously, the excerpts of what Putin said that have been provided us by the Kremlin do not allude to any of this, but they do include certain comments that Putin made, including this one. Special attention must be paid to the nuclear triad, which has been and remains the guarantor of Russia's sovereignty, playing a key role in maintaining the global balance of power. Currently, the share of modern weaponry and equipment in the strategic nuclear forces has already reached 95%. This is a good indicator. In fact, it is the highest indicator amongst all nuclear powers in the world. That is a pointed reminder that whatever damage the Ukrainians might have done as a result of their attack on the air bases, it has not done more than dent, probably in a fairly minor way, the overall strategic balance, which remains overall somewhat in Russia's favor, though when one is talking about nuclear weapons, obviously, it really is perhaps less consequential quite how many nuclear weapons any particular superpower has relative to the others, given that each of the three superpowers, the United States, China and Russia, probably have between them enough nuclear weapons to destroy all of life on Earth. Just saying. But anyway, what Putin is saying is that this attack has not made any real significant difference. But then Putin went on to say this: based on the experience of the special military operation, aviation of the aerospace forces makes a significant contribution to the destruction of enemy targets. Therefore, the state program being developed must include a set of system-wide and consistent measures for the creation, procurement for the needs of the Russian armed forces, modernization and repair of aircraft and aviation strike systems. Now, I also have heard that in another part of this discussion, Putin apparently said, it was apparently shown him saying it on Russian state television, but it is not in this transcript provided by the Kremlin, that the Russian authorities would also have to take steps in future to protect their strategic assets, their aircraft, from air attack, presumably by creating shelters for them. And the key thing to say here is that with Russia apparently transitioning to a new generation of strategic bombers based on stealth indicators and things of that kind, that is probably anyway an advisable measure, because apparently stealth bombers need to be housed in special shelters. They cannot be left visible in the open like the bombers were which the Ukrainians attacked. Now, all of that suggests to me that the START treaty, which is due for renewal at the end of this year, is all but dead. There is going to have to be, at the very least, an extensive renegotiation of it, but the Russians almost certainly are not going to agree to extend it in its current form. Putin, incidentally, over the course of this meeting, also made clear that in terms of future military procurement, the priority from this point onwards will be the army. Now, Russia basically began to rebuild its military after the conflict with Georgia in 2008, and this all began to swing into very much higher gear around 2014, 2015. Between the period of the fall of the Soviet Union and 2014, 2015, it may surprise people to learn that the Russian military basically procured no new weapons at all. The industrial and economic crisis was so severe that Russia basically stood still with the weapons it had inherited from the Soviet Union. When the Russians did begin to modernize their military in the mid-2000s, their initial priority was to rebuild their strategic forces, to sort out their radar systems, their ability to track American systems. They focused more on those things. They also focused on rebuilding their nuclear forces, their intercontinental ballistic missiles, their submarines, their nuclear submarines, their things of that kind. The conventional forces continued for a very long time to have to make do with what they had. And that, by the way, was still largely the case as of the time of the start of the special military operation in February 2022. That now is going to change. I go back to what Putin is saying. The dominant force in modern military operations of any scale and intensity remains the ground forces. It is crucial to enhance their combat capabilities in the shortest possible time, establish a solid foundation for development, and ensure the design of advanced models and weapon systems with the highest tactical and technical characteristics and modernization potential. So we are going to start to see over the next couple of years new weapon systems start to appear, weapon systems that the Russians probably have already working on, maybe modified versions of things like the Armata tank and the Kurganets infantry fighting vehicle, projects that were initiated around 2011, 2012, first displayed in parades in 2015, neglected since then. But it may be something completely different from that. And anyway, the Russians are going to look into the lessons they've learned from the special military operation, and they're going to use them to develop their armed forces. Incidentally, and perhaps not coincidentally, the chief executive officer of Rostec, the organization that brings together the Russian military industrial complex, Sergei Chemezov, has spoken about what the Russians think of the various Western tanks and armored vehicles that they have captured in Ukraine. And the answer is not very much. This is what he had to say about the Abrams. Our experts have examined the US-made Abrams tank and found nothing to borrow. I'm curious to have a look at the British Challenger tank. However, it is clear it is a cooking pot unready for real combat. The main problem of most foreign vehicles is complicated design and labor-intensive maintenance. The Ukrainian example shows the result. We study all trophies. If we find anything useful, we borrow it. Sometimes we see it as a good vehicle, but it cannot be engaged in our conditions. Thus, the German Leopard tank has modern components, fire controls, a powerful engine, but strange temperature restrictions. We did not see any breakthrough solutions and have nothing to borrow from the Leopard for ourselves. That's what Chemezov has to say about Western tanks. They're overcomplicated, over-engineered, altogether too heavy. They don't work very well, and they're not suitable for combat. And though he clearly doesn't think much of the Abrams tank, but does think that there are a few features of the Leopard tank which are interesting. Its ability, by the way, to reverse rapidly, I suspect, being one. He clearly thinks that the Challenger tank, the British Challenger tank, is, well, he said, a cooking pot. In other words, a vehicle more dangerous to its crews than to the enemy. The armoured vehicle that he appears to think amongst the Western armoured vehicles is the most effective is the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. But even about that, he doesn't seem to be especially impressed. Bradley infantry fighting vehicles have one serious weakness: problems with their cross-country capability, due to which they cannot move normally on rough terrain and through fields. They get stuck in dense soil and become an easy target due to their huge dimensions. What's the use of improved protection if the result is the same? Practically, all the Bradleys supplied to Ukraine have been destroyed now. You have to understand, after all, that an infantry fighting vehicle is not a tank. It should be quick, mobile, and capable of moving across rough terrain and across rivers, afloat without bridges and roads. Our infantry fighting vehicles are capable of this, whereas American vehicles are not. Well, you might think that Yuri Chemezov is overstating things. Perhaps he is. I suspect that this is the general Russian consensus about Western weaponry altogether. It has been, for the Russians, an interesting experience to come up against it, and they are overall underwhelmed by what they have found. Now, coming back to this meeting that has taken place in the Kremlin, where all the military people were brought together, I suspect that we are going to see over the next couple of weeks further results from this meeting, and probably the previous Security Council meetings, plural, focusing perhaps increasingly on Britain, but also maybe on Ukraine, considering what further steps to take in terms of waging against Ukraine the dirty war, Russia's response to the dirty war. Now, I've had a very interesting information about the attack on the British Visa Centre in Kiev. This information comes from Russian sources, just to say. Apparently, the Russians believe that this is where the British not only trained the Ukrainians in covert activities inside Russia, but worked to provide them with fake documents, forged documents, to enable them to function inside Russia. Supposedly, the British were mostly involved in that kind of thing, and that it was the actual visa, the premises of the visa centre, that were being used to manufacture these fake documents, and that the Russians were providing all of those documents there to the Ukrainians. That may very well be true, and I suspect that it probably is, though I would quickly add that I'm confident that the Ukrainians can fake documents themselves, and I wonder whether the British are really better at that sort of thing than the Ukrainians are. But anyway, that is apparently what the Russians believe, and I have that on very good authority, by the way, and that is why the visa centre was targeted. The Russians are going to target Britain even further. I have read an extraordinary report by, I think it was Kit Clarenberg, in the Grey Zone, talking about Britain's secret war against the Russians in the Black Sea. And somehow or other, Kit Clarenberg has managed to get his hands on all kinds of secret documents prepared by circulated inside Britain. Some of this material, I have to say, is eye-opening, and I wonder how he obtained it and from whom. But anyway, we read things like this. Sensitive documents reviewed by the Grey Zone indicate that the United Kingdom is the central architect behind Ukrainian military operations targeting Russia's Black Sea Fleet. If you read the Daily Telegraph, as I do every day, none of that will surprise you. We then go on to read, among other explosive findings, the file reveal high-ranking British military and intelligence figures drew up detailed plans to maximize attrition of Moscow's Black Sea Fleet, plotted to blow up the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to mainland Russia with fertilizer bombs, and even devised blueprints for a series of submersibles which would allow Ukrainian divers to plant mines on Russian ships and infrastructure. There's other absolutely incredible things that really do come straight out of spy fiction. Further machinations include an explicit honey trap plan which called for establishing a brothel secretly run by British intelligence in Crimea. There, Russian-speaking female Ukrainian agents would ply drunken sailors from the Russian Navy for information. The schemes were assembled by Project Alchemy, a secret British military planning cell whose existence was first exposed by the Grey Zone. Now, I'm not going to read more of this article. For example, for one thing, I think you should read it yourselves in the Grey Zone. It came out yesterday on the 11th of June, and it is, as I said, by Kit Clarenberg. Its title is Secret British Plans to Defeat Entire Russian Black Sea Fleet Revealed in Leaks. And we discover how heavily involved the British were in all the operations to defeat the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. Now, put aside the fact that this operation has not been a success. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, contrary to the breathless claims you read in the Daily Telegraph, has been barely dented by all of these activities that the British have been up to. What the British have done, actually, is expend nearly their entire stockpile of Storm Shadow missiles, trying to destroy the Russian Black Sea Fleet, most of which, the vast bulk of which, still survives. The Kerch Bridge, the Crimean Bridge, also still survives. In fact, it survives undented and continues to receive traffic. And of course, the Russians have built railway lines which connect their mainland to Crimea, so that the Crimean Bridge is no longer a significant target either. The British probably played a significant role in creating all the water drones, which the Ukrainians have used earlier in the war to some effect. But the Russians have developed counters to the water drones, and they seem to have become increasingly less effective. As to whatever operations these Ukrainian divers have achieved, I see little evidence that they've amounted to very much. And as for honey trap plans and brothels in Crimea, well, that doesn't seem to have worked well either. And the assumption that Russian sailors turn up at brothels in presumably Sevastopol, drunk and ready to spill out secrets. Again, as I said, that seems to me straight out of spy fiction. I wonder how much actual connection any of this has with reality, or ever did. I am not going to get into the details of all of this. As I said, you can read it all in the article yourself. Also, I have to say that one of the premise of much of this that the British were working to prevent a Russian blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea coast has always seemed to me to be wrong. I've discussed this in many programs. The Russians have never imposed a blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea coast. If they wanted to, they have all of the means at their disposal. They have submarines, which could torpedo merchant ships. They can lay mines. They have lots of aircraft that can target ships on the sea. They could say that they're creating a free fire zone in the Western Black Sea, and it is all but inconceivable in that case that ship owners, Western ship owners, would be able to get insurance from London to be able to send their ships there. The Russians have never shown any indication, given any inclination that they are prepared to do these things. When the Black Sea deal was first discussed in the summer of 2022, I remember Putin making precisely the point that Russia had not ever imposed, in fact, a blockade, for example, on Ukrainian food exports. And this is absolutely true. The Russians have and do attack container ships that go to Odessa with what the Russians believe is military material. In fact, they've been doing this several times over the last few weeks, but they have never imposed an outright blockade on Ukraine's maritime trade. Just saying. So this whole premise of this naval campaign that the British have been talking about, and which is discussed at length in this article, anyway, seems to me to be completely wrong. Just saying. But anyway, put all that aside, is it really wise for Britain to involve itself in operations of this kind? Is it really the case that it is sensible for Britain to plan to destroy someone else's navy? Bear in mind that the Royal Navy, according to Ian Proud, and I'm sure he's right, now consists of 8 warships. 8 warships, half of which are in port. These, I'm talking, I should stress, surface ships, but even the nuclear submarine force is apparently in a poor state of maintenance and repair, and Britain struggles to maintain a patrol of one naval submarine with Trident intercontinental sea-launched ballistic missiles at any one time, as the naval doctrines require. So, given that the Black Sea Fleet is only one Russian fleet, and the Russians have lots of other fleets, and the bulk of their naval power, anyway, is in the Arctic and in the Pacific, presumably out of reach of us, and given that this campaign that Klarenberg has exposed has, as I said, only dented the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The main assets, the Admiral Makarov class frigates, most of the missile boats, the submarines, all of those, they remain intact. Given that this is so, and given how arguably vulnerable our fleet is, if the Russians decide, take it upon themselves, to come after us in response to this, is it really wise for us in Britain to be involved in things like this? I can't help but get the sense, when I read things like this, that these are public school boys playing games, reading far too much of Le Carré and Ian Fleming, reliving the adventures of the Second World War, fantasizing about some great naval victory, which is far beyond our resources, against a foe who is far more powerful than ourselves, and who anyway never wanted to be our foe in the first place. I mean, the special military operation has been conducted by Russia against Ukraine, not us. And there was no fundamental reason for us to be involved, given that Ukraine is not our ally. I mean, none of this makes any sort of sense to me. It is yet another example of how we have gone completely overboard with all of this in Britain. We continue to indulge the fantasy that we can do these things against the Russians and that there will be no consequences. We treat this all like some great board game where people, like the sort of people that were involved in these plans, and you can read all about them in Kit Clarenberg's article, think that they can play these games, and they don't ask themselves ever the question of what does this potentially lead to for Britain. You want to make Russia an enemy, especially at a time, to repeat again, and it's not I who say this, our very own strategic defence review in Britain has just basically hinted at this. If we're looking to make an enemy of a country far more powerful than ourselves, when the country that we depend upon for our security, which is the United States, is perhaps thinking of distancing itself from us and from Europe, and as I discussed earlier in the programme, looks like it's starting to distance itself from Ukraine. Now, if you wonder why there is this panic and alarm and hysteria in Europe, I discussed all of this yesterday, why we talk all the time about the fact that the Russians might come, that the Russian army is on the way, that the Russians aren't going to stop in Ukraine, they're going to take over Moldova and Georgia and the Baltic states and Scandinavia and Central Europe and come hunting for us eventually too. Well, is it not just possible that having played these silly games for so long, all of these public school boys are now perhaps starting to ask themselves the question, my God, what have we done? But if so, they show no sign of wanting to stop. I said in a programme that we did together, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran, that the British seem unable to kick the addiction. We urgently need to do exactly that. We need to kick the addiction before we get into serious and real trouble. Now, somebody pointed out to me that in the program I did recently about the David Ignatius article in the Washington Post, the one in which he talked about how the Ukrainians might be looking to come after merchant ships, not just Russian merchant ships, but merchant ships of Russian allies, that put aside China, it could be that another country that might be targeted is North Korea. Well, if it is North Korea, then all I can say is that the Ukrainians absolutely do have a death wish, because the North Koreans, whatever you might think about the Russians, the North Koreans certainly do not strike me as the sort of people who, if you start doing things to them, are going to back off. They absolutely are indeed going to come after you, and they will come after you in all kinds of ways. And we've seen this happen in many places and at many times. Well, if our Ukrainian friends start getting themselves in those sort of troubles, never mind the Russians. Do we really want in Britain to get mixed up with the North Koreans as well? And perhaps the Chinese? And heavens knows who else? I mean, this is folly, piling upon folly. And in the interests of Britain, and for the good of Britain and of the British people, it must stop. Well, that's my programme for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X, and you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop where we have a massive promotion, and you can find all sorts of amazing things that you can buy. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember that you can also tick the like button and check your subscription to this video if you've liked this video. Check to this channel if you've liked this video. Anyway, that's me for today. There'll be more from me soon, tomorrow in fact, and until then, have a very good day.